Well, hello there, and welcome to this LinkedIn Live masterclass on why employees switch off and how to keep them turned on. We are your host, Russell Olivia Brooklands. And if you don't know us and you're wondering why is he just referred to himself in the plural, it's because we have a rare medical condition, which means that our body simply works better when we do so. It's a neurodivergence thing. And we have we just want to tell you a couple of things about the way in which this is going to work. This platform, in case you're unfamiliar with it, actually works on a kind of time delay. So what you're seeing now is something that we would have said about 40 seconds ago. So this is not like Teams or Zoom or whatever where it's instantaneous. There is a delay. So if we ask you a question and you want to put in a comment or something, it will take a while for it to come through. We can't do sort of immediate interaction. That's just kind of how it works apparently. But as for more about our background and why are we qualified to talk about this whole issue of why employees switch off? Well, we started our career back in the late 80s, actually, as a copywriter, working for Zurich Insurance. And then we got promoted to a role of a brand manager, a corporate brand manager, and we got responsibility for the company's language standards. And that's going to be really relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, because we discovered all sorts of stuff when we were doing that, particularly as a result of having started to study behavioral linguistics, which come into play as we'll be going through this session. You start to see things that make you go, oh, didn't know about that. Or maybe you do know about it. We will discover as we go. But then in 1996, we set up on our own as a consultant and trainer. Since when we've worked with a huge number of different organizations in the commercial sector, GlaxoSmithKline, Lloyds Banking Group, Airbus, and so on. And in the public sector with the Department for Work and Pensions, with GCHQ at the heart of the British security establishment, the European Central Bank, and the United Nations. So we've been around the block, we've seen a lot, and we have a great deal of experience to share with you. So if you'd like to sort of say hi in the comments or something, then please do so we know that you're actually with us. And also, something we'd be curious about is what are your concerns about why employees switch off and how to keep them turned on? What does it mean for you if employees keep switching off? What would you like to get sorted today, if possible? What would you like to understand? What does it mean for you and your team? And also, what does it mean for your organization? So if you want to send us a comment, we hope that the comments will show up and we'll be able to read them and go through them as we run through this session. So while we're waiting for you to respond, if you're going to, we don't know if you will or you won't, but if you do, that would be brilliant. And we look forward to seeing your comments. But let's just quickly give you an overview of what we're going to be covering as we go through this session. There are essentially four different things. First of all, it's really important to understand what are the current risks and the costs to your organization of having employees switch off. Because obviously, if you want to change things, then maybe your leaders, your key decision makers are going to think, well, what's in it for the organization if you do that? So being able to explain that is a useful starting point. And then we're going to get into a number of what we might call usual suspects. Now, we put a question mark at the end of that. Why? Well, these are things that people sort of know are probably going on, but maybe they haven't thought about why are they going on? What's causing these challenges that make employees switch off? And once we've dealt with those, then we're going to get into some really fascinating stuff with unusual suspects. Things that people sort of, generally speaking, don't even realize are happening, but they kind of do. It's kind of going on in the background. It's very subtle and subliminal, but maybe people haven't connected up the dots quite as much as they might. And then we're going to finish off by talking about how you might be able to take action on this. Because one of the things that we are famous for among our friends in particular is a phrase that they kind of know, oh, that's such a Rob thing. The phrase we use so often is, well, this is all very well, but... And by the time we get to the end of this session, you might be in the position of thinking, well, this is all very well, but what am I supposed to do now? So we'll talk through how, if you want to work with us or how you want to actually take this forward, we can actually work through different options that you have for actually making things happen. So you can make the differences that you want. So that being the case, we have got some comments. Fantastic. Never miss. I don't know. No, that's hi, Tara. Hello. You spent your career focusing on employee engagement and communication and change management consultancy. Well, thank you. Lovely to have you here. What are your concerns about that, though? If you've got any views on that, that would be brilliant. It's nice to know that the system is actually working, because in the past it has kind of fallen over a bit. So it's brilliant to know that people are actually here and getting this. So let us begin by looking at the costs and the risks that are inherent within the idea of employees switching off. What is the problem with that? Well, first of all, and this may be slightly tangential to start with, but it can result in wasted audience time. Now, that's not exactly because they switched off, but it is undeniably related to it. And this is a really important point to bear in mind, because very often internal communication specialists are working within either marketing or PR and so on. They're expected to follow those sorts of approaches. And the difficulty is that external communications, well, they're operating in an open system where anybody can see an external communication. And the thing is that whilst the organization will have paid for that advertising space, for that whatever it is, the audience's time comes for free. So, if people switch off, well, it doesn't really matter. If you've got someone who's receiving a communication for whom it's not appropriate and they're going, not for me, for whatever reason, that's absolutely fine. It's not a problem because their time comes for free. Whereas if it's an internal communication, all the time that people are having their time wasted, that's actually costing the organization money. And we'll come back to how that relates to the switch off thing in a short while. But that's the first issue we just need to address. And then the question of, well, what else happens? If you haven't wasted audience time and people switch off, well, then we're into a whole raft of what we might call failure costs and risks. And there are 6 of these. So first off, there's the fact that, well, if the communication has failed, it's probably going to have to be done again, isn't it? Which means incurring the audience time a second time around. And if people have already got it and they're receiving this communication a second time around and they're already doing what was being asked of them, they're having their time wasted. Whereas all the people who didn't do it first time around had their time wasted first time around. So, it's all kind of problematic from that perspective. Then there's a real biggie. The mistakes and the misunderstandings that people can get involved in because they didn't actually know what was supposed to be going on, what they were supposed to be doing, or is that my job? Is it someone else's job? And so on. And all sorts of mistakes and misunderstandings can arise as a result of that. And then, of course, all the time that people are spending receiving repeat communications or communications they never needed, or correcting the mistakes and misunderstandings, they're not actually getting on with the day job. There's the opportunities to actually generate more revenue or reduce operating costs. Those are being missed. And then another biggie is the possibility of employee disengagement, not just disengagement from the communications, but general disengagement from their very role, which can mean people either maybe throwing sickies or just walking out the door or just not doing the job as well as they need to, and so on and so forth. And that can increase, obviously, if people are walking out the door, you've got higher staff churn, then there's the possibility of higher recruitment costs and retraining costs and. So this starts to get to be really kind of serious. And then there's also the possibility of the damage that can be done to the brand. If people are, making mistakes and customers are on the receiving end of those mistakes, that's hardly going to do the customer reputation, the customer brand any good, is it? And then finally, if communications keep failing and people keep switching off, you can end up in a situation where either an individual department or an entire organization is simply failing to fulfill its very purpose. And when it comes to departmental failures, it's usually the IT people who get it in the neck most, because when they kind of are failing to fulfill their purpose, everybody knows about it. So these are 6 very serious costs and risks that can arise as a result of employees switching off. So just let's put that in our back pocket before we move on to the question of what's actually causing this. Okay, this is where we turn our attention to the usual suspects. And we said we put a question mark at the end because lots of people kind of know these, but what's really going on? What's causing them? And is there anything you can do about it? And perhaps one of the most usual suspects of all, why employees switch off, is simply because of the amount of noise that's going on, because there's so much coming at them. And what's fascinating for us is that so often we see people on LinkedIn talking about the need for internal communication to cut through the noise. Every time we see that, we kind of go, what? And there's a question you can ask in relation to that, this idea of internal communication needing to cut through the noise. And that is simply to ask the question, what noise? Oh, you mean the noise of all those other people doing all their internal communicating? That's the noise that internal communication needs to cut through. So hang on, let's get this straight. So what you're saying is that internal communication needs to cut through the noise of internal communication. It's a bonkers way of thinking about it, which is not to say it doesn't need to happen at all, but maybe that's not the most effective way of thinking about it. Maybe what's more effective would be to actually reduce the amount of noise. What if you could do that? So there isn't as much noise that you need to cut through. Is it more likely that fewer people would switch off if there were less noise going on? We think there probably would be, but how on earth could you do that? Well, the starting point may seem a bit weird, but we think it actually comes down to begin by talking about your job title. That in fact, what you need to do is describe yourself as an internal communication specialist. An awful lot of people describe themselves as internal communication practitioners and very often as internal communication professionals. Now, it's partly a personal thing. We have a problem with the word professional because it sounds a bit corporate bullshitty, to be honest, and like almost methinks they doth protest too much. Not only that, but if you think about it, everybody communicates at work, at least with their boss and usually with their, colleagues and other peers, which means that anybody could claim, well, I'm being paid money to communicate, therefore I'm an internal communication professional. So that's kind of problematic. We think it's far more useful to describe yourself as a specialist, because other people aren't going to describe themselves as internal communication specialists. They might be HR specialists or IT specialists, finance specialists, customer care specialists. They're not internal communication specialists. So that's a useful way of separating yourself from everybody else. But why does that matter? Well, because, as we've just said, everybody communicates at work. So everybody, regardless of whether they're any good at it or not, could describe themselves as an internal communication practitioner. But why does that matter? Well, because it means that internal communication is the only business activity which is subject to two truth gaps, which are helping to contribute to all of the noise that's going on. And the first of these truth gaps is, oh, hi, Regine. Oh, we've got someone who's on not a fun run, but doing a run in Texas at the moment, who's joined us. Lovely that you're here. Tanya, hi. Thanks for joining us. So what's the issue with the fact that everybody communicates at work? Well, because everybody is doing that, and not everybody manages people. Not everybody manages budgets. Not everybody manages IT systems or does legal work or customer care or whatever. But because everybody communicates at work, that means this truth gap, the first truth gap that exists, is enshrined in the phrase, anyone can do it. Now, if you think about it, that statement has to be true because everybody does communicate at work. However, it doesn't just have a literal meaning, does it? It also has a colloquial meaning. And if someone says, come on, anyone can do that, what they're implying is that it takes no specialist skills or insights to do the job as well as anybody else. Is it any wonder that you may not have all the respect and influence that you want if everybody thinks they can do your job every bit as well as you do? But it gets worse, because if people fall through the gap between the literal truth of the phrase anyone can do it and the colloquial falsehood, chances are they are then going to tell themselves, I should be good at internal communication because anyone can do it. And this is when things can get really interesting, because the challenge is that the very word should is ambiguous as well. So when people tell themselves they should be good at internal communication and are making loads of unnecessary noise as a result, what's going on inside them and how can we actually change that dynamic? So let's think about those different meanings of the word should. So if, for example, someone were to say, on a crowded train, you really should give up your seat for a pregnant woman, shouldn't you? Of course you should, yes. What does the word should mean in that context? Well, what it's implying is a sense of duty or obligation. Okay, so that's one meaning that should can have. And you could say, do people have a duty or an obligation to be good at internal communication? It's difficult to argue that that's probably the case. It's a key part of most people's job. It's part of what they're being paid for and so on. So it would unquestionably be the case that, yes, people do kind of have a duty to be good at internal communication. However, let's imagine another scenario in which someone is going away for a romantic weekend. They're going off to Paris and they're flying from London and they're just not very sure about how long should they allow for the flight. And so they ask one of their mates and their mate tells them, well, a flight from London to Paris, that should take about an hour, shouldn't it? Oh, it should take about an hour? Are we saying it has a duty and obligation to take it out? No. That's not what's meant there. If someone says it should take about an hour, what they actually mean is it would be reasonable to expect that it probably will take about an hour. So here we have should, meaning reasonable expectation. Okay, very different meaning from duty or obligation. So what happens if we put these two different meanings of should side by side in relation to whether or not people should be good at internal communication? Well, yeah, we know they have a duty or obligation, but is that expectation a reasonable one? Now, they may kid themselves it is because, as they've already said, anyone can do it. But is it actually true? Let's just think through three different possibilities that could make it reasonable to expect all of those people who are making all of that noise to be good at internal communication. We already know that they're not good at it. Otherwise, they wouldn't be making that needless noise. But why might they be kidded, and what's going on here? Because if we can understand this, then we can look at how you might be able to turn it around. So in order to have the first understanding of what could make it reasonable for people to be good at internal communication, we need to go back to 2003, when the human genome was finally mapped. All of that work was done, and the people who did the mapping won the Nobel Prize and whatever, and it was all very exciting. And one of the things that became apparent, which was really puzzling, was that huge swathes of human DNA didn't seem to be doing anything. No one knew what it was there for. And so over the subsequent years, there's been lots of research into human DNA to understand what are we looking at here. And occasionally, certainly in the early years, there would be announcements that would come up on the news and so on about, they just discovered, the smart gene or the ginger gene or the skinny gene or whatever they were given these names. But it wasn't until 2020 that another gene was discovered. And unfortunately, because it happened during the pandemic, when everyone's concern was, with other medical matters, this just got lost in all of that other noise. Because what had been discovered was something that's unique to the human genome, and it's the internal communication gene. And this gene remains dormant, when we're children, when we're growing up. But when we leave school or university and go out to work, this gene will kick in at that point. And because it's part of our DNA, it just enables any human being to instinctively know exactly how to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how in any business situation they ever encounter without anyone ever having to teach them. It's brilliant, isn't it? Yeah, it doesn't exist. You know it doesn't exist. We know, everybody knows it doesn't exist. However, pretty much every single organization on the planet behaves as if it did exist, because they do expect people to just instinctively know how to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how without being taught. Or do they? Hang on a second, Brooklands. That's nonsense. What about all of those training courses people can do? The business training courses, writing skills and presentation skills and interpersonal skills and so on. Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. What are those courses actually teaching people? If you look at the content of what people are learning in those courses, it's pretty much always about how to execute communications more effectively, not how to identify what, if anything, actually needs communicating in the first place or to whom it would be relevant. So if, as is the case, human beings do not have an internal communication gene, which they don't, and if the training courses aren't cutting it, which they aren't, then what's left? It means that actually everybody, through no fault of their own, every employee in your organization and pretty much every organization has essentially been backed into this really disempowering corner, whereby they have effectively a duty to fulfill an unreasonable expectation, being expected to be able to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how, when they've got no genetic predisposition to be able to do that, and they haven't been taught how to do it. So how do people respond to that? How can they respond to it? Well, it turns out that really everybody seems to go about it in pretty much the same way, which is to basically muddle through, doing their best to work it out as they go throughout their career, hopefully getting better and better and better at identifying what needs communicating to whom, when, and how by means of, well, the only option they've got really is trial and error, isn't it? Which means that, okay, hang on a second. It means that your internal communication practices across your organization are relying of all of those employees engaging in trial and error, which has two components to it, doesn't it? The first being trial, and the second leading us to a rather inconvenient truth, which is that pretty much everyone's internal communication practices, at least for a while, have got error kind of hardwired into them. Now, obviously, some people get better more quickly than others. Some people have more of a natural disposition for getting used to this stuff, and other people struggle for an awful lot longer. But the error is almost certainly there pretty much across your organization to some extent, which may be giving rise to an awful lot of noise. Okay. And it could be that people are making noise as a result of producing communications that don't need to exist at all, or because they haven't done their communicating as well as they might, so they're having to do it again, those repeat communications that are going on, which means they need your help. What if you could help them? But help them to do what? Well, perhaps you might be able to help them to reduce their needless communicating and also their communication failures. This is what we're going to start looking at. How could you actually do it? Is that even doable? Well, let's think about this for a second, because one of the things that we so often find when we're asked to work with internal communication teams, their manager will very often say, I want my team to have more confidence. And yeah, well, of course they're going to say that. They're hardly going to say, I want my team to be riddled with self-doubt, are they? However, is it actually true that they want their team to have more confidence? Is confidence really a want? Let's think about that for a moment. Just imagine for a second that your confidence suddenly disappeared. It just disappeared completely. And what would happen to you? How would your body react if your confidence just left you? Well, chances are you probably go into the old fight, flight, freeze response. That's kind of what happens, which means confidence isn't really a want. It's a need. We need to have confidence in what we're doing. But what happens if it isn't there? If we just put in a situation where, I have to do this thing and then what very often people do is they resort to one of two different types of what we could call false flag forms of confidence, just to kind of cope with the situation they're in. And one of those is, you're probably familiar with it, the old fake it till you make it thing. And people, very often spend an awful lot of time engaging in fake it till you make it, sometimes years, faking it in the hope that nobody notices that they're not quite sure what they're doing and so on. And that's why they can often have imposter syndrome, which is not healthy. It's not psychologically healthy for people to be in that situation. But that's not necessarily always what's going on, because fake it till you make it is something that an individual would often need to do or feel they need to do. But if it's a group situation, we've often worked with project teams where, they've been very skillful, dedicated, smart people, but they're still not sure, is this actually going to work out? And are the directions we're receiving clear and whatever? And what can happen in group situations is not so much fake it till you make it, but more a sort of cross your fingers and hope kind of thing that's going on. Now, that again is not healthy for either the emotional well-being of the people who are having to do that or the operational well-being of the organization in which it's happening. So what do people actually need instead? What's the antidote to those? We would say that this is justifiable confidence that people need, which is confidence, we describe it as being rooted in a sufficient quantity of relevant, credible evidence. And back in 2023, we actually put together a model for redesigning internal communication practices, which could deliver justifiable confidence in how they've been designed. And we thought that was really cool. And we were just about to go public with it when we suddenly had a crisis of confidence. Surprise, surprise. Because we thought, well, if we were to go public and, publicize on LinkedIn and whatever, hey, everybody, we can enable you to have justifiable confidence in your internal communication practices, there might well have been plenty of people who would suggest that, or who would say, yes, please, we'd love that. But then there would be plenty of others who would suggest that it was a bit of an insult. And they would say, how dare you? How dare you suggest that my confidence isn't justifiable already? Look at my qualifications. Look at my track record. Look at my salary. Look at my job title. And you tell me that my confidence isn't justified? And so we thought, hang on a minute, we must be missing something here. Because these same people who would be saying that they had justifiable confidence were often the people who were complaining on LinkedIn about not having all the leadership influence they wanted. So we thought, what are we missing here? And it took us 5 months before we realized that justifiable confidence is absolutely essential, and it's not enough unless everybody is sharing in that justifiable confidence. That's what's actually needed. Supposing you could enable the employees in your organization, starting perhaps with line managers, to have shared justifiable confidence in how they are identifying what needs communicating to whom, when, and how. What would that do for the amount of noise that's going on? Would that not have a significant impact? And what would that do for the value you are adding to your organization? That's interesting, isn't it? But it then raises the question of, okay, again, that's all very well, but how might you do that? Well, let's actually come at this from maybe a slightly different perspective. Let's recognize that the first thing that's needed is, if you're going to reduce the noise, that you need to essentially enable people to be effectively identifying their internal communication needs, because it seems self-evident that at the moment they don't know how to do that. Okay, so let's ask a couple of questions, because the first thing we need to just bear in mind is that, well, hang on a second, you're the internal communication specialist, aren't you? So that probably means that you're pretty good at identifying internal communication needs. Now, whether you have a formal briefing process that's actually documented or you're carrying it around in your head, what if you were to share that process that you're using with everyone else in your organization? Have you done that? Has it occurred to you, hang on a second, why don't we provide everyone else with, we've got this process that we're using and it works. What if we just let everyone else actually copy what we're doing? Now, some people might think, oh, but if I did that, then I wouldn't be special anymore. Anyone could do my job and that would undermine my authority. No. Let's just recalibrate that, because, and look at it from a different lens, because there are all of the line managers around your organization who are budget holders, right? They all have to manage their budgets. And what's happened there is that the finance specialists have provided exactly that kind of support. Whole series of practice standards and how-tos, and these are the procedures you need to go through. This is how to actually manage your budget. Okay. Are the finance team out of business? Are they out of work? No, there's loads of other stuff that needs doing. In addition to that, what they are doing is they're making it easier for line managers to do that part of their job effectively. And that, in essence, is what we're talking about you being able to do here. However, we wouldn't suggest you do it until you can answer another question first, which is the question of whether the design of your briefing process as it is at the moment is capable of delivering that shared justifiable confidence. Have you designed it in a way that you are justifiably confident it can do that? That may be a slightly tricky question to answer at the moment, but it's worth thinking about, because one way of considering this is to think about the whole, when you're getting on a plane and you're told, you know, if you've got children, whatever, put your own oxygen mask on first. That's kind of what we're looking at here. How secure is your oxygen mask when it comes to the shareable, justifiable confidence? Because if you're still, oh, hang on a second, not sure if the briefing process we've got is actually capable of delivering shareable, justifiable confidence, in which case, if you were to share it and other people start using it and they're thinking, well, this doesn't work very well, then, you know, obviously you've got a problem. So it's a case of let's clean that up and make sure that your briefing process can deliver shared justifiable confidence. And then if you were to share it with other people around your organization, that in turn could potentially help to reduce the amount of noise through which your communications need to cut. So maybe you weren't expecting that, but this is where we've got to. Can you see there is a kind of a logic to doing it in this way? That if you can help improve the quality of thinking that everyone else is doing before they start communicating, they might do a better job of it. There will be less noise, and therefore there will be less reason for people to switch off. Okay, so if we've taken care of the briefing process, that was the first of the usual suspects, and we appreciate that was quite a bit to go through. But the next one is actually quite a bit quicker, because what we need to think about as well is also the question of vocabulary, because vocabulary can often switch people off, and most notably things like jargon and corporate speak. And let's just do a very quick exercise here. If it's okay for you, you may be in a situation where you're unable to sort of do a little bit of visualizing. But if you're capable of doing that, then we'd like to do a little exercise with you and just invite you to just see how readily you can picture in your mind's eye what the following sentence means. Okay, we're going to give you a sentence to visualize, and let's see how easily you can do so. Okay, so if you'd like to close your eyes to make it easier, the sentence is this: Barack Obama is sipping the cold water slowly. Okay, open your eyes. We're guessing that you might be able to see something in that particular sentence, that you were able to visualize something with whatever degree of clarity you could. Okay. And some people say, I'm great at visualizing, although I'm not very good at visualizing. It doesn't really matter. What matters is how clearly you could see that sentence when compared to the next sentence we're going to give you. Okay. So if you would be willing to, oh, by the way, did you get breakfast this morning? Not remotely interested. Just wanted to make sure that we got rid of the last image. So close your eyes. Here's the second sentence. It's important to rationalize communications strategically. How clearly can you see that compared to the previous sentence? Probably not very clearly at all. In fact, pretty much no one can. What's the difference? Well, the difference is that the first sentence was full of concrete language, whereas the second sentence was full of vague abstractions. And it's very difficult for people to see clearly in their mind's eye anything that's really vague and abstract. So one thing that you can do, and of course people are going to kind of like you to switch off if they simply can't make sense of what's being said to them. It raises the risk of them thinking, I don't even get this. What's the point of, wasting my time with it? So making language as concrete as possible is extremely useful for keeping people switched on. Okay, very, very simple thing to do. One more thing on vocabulary we would like to mention is related to the whole DEI question. Now, we need to be careful about this because lots of people respond in lots of different ways to different aspects of DEI. And there is a risk, obviously, if your vocabulary is kind of excluding people. They may feel excluded as a result and therefore switch off. But one thing that we know for sure is that a lot of people get caught up and very, very concerned about pronouns. Okay, now we can speak, from experience here, obviously, because we use the plural pronoun ourselves. But when we started telling people that we would start using the plural pronouns, a lot of very, very kind people were saying, oh, so how would you like us to talk about you? Should we be using he or should we be using they? And our response to that was, well, actually, we prefer it if you used you. If you're talking to us, use you. Don't worry about he or they. That's not the issue. The third person stuff only matters when people aren't actually being addressed. So when it comes to people switching off, certainly as far as the pronouns are concerned, it's a bit of a red herring. It's not something to be totally concerned about. As we will discover, there are other things that can be going on which may be confusing and muddying the issue. So we will come back to this in a few moments. But for now, just know that if you want to actually talk to people, well, talk to people in the second person, use you, that is the most appropriate pronoun to be using because it works for singular or plural. Okay, so whether they describe themselves as he or she or they, you will work across the piece anyway. So another question for you to consider. Does your organization have explicit language standards at the moment? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. And if it does, then are they sort of kept within just the communication teams or are they used more widely? And again, as before, if you do have language standards, can those standards deliver that shared justifiable confidence? Now, you might think, oh, no idea. That's kind of a tough one to to answer. Well, let's make it easier to answer then by turning our attention to the unusual suspects that we promised you. Now, for this, we need to consider something that, generally speaking, people are not that aware of, or they are aware of, but they don't know quite what's going on. Do you ever have a situation in which you're reading a communication and you get to a certain point in it and you start thinking, hang on, is this talking to me or is it talking to someone else? Because it feels like it's talking to someone else. Even though I thought it was supposed to be for me, but it doesn't feel like it anymore. You ever have that kind of thing? Pretty much everybody we know has experienced that, possibly more frequently than they realize. So a couple of things. First of all, when that happens, what do you do with that communication? Oh, if you're like most people, you probably switched off, you probably ditch it and move on to something else. Okay, so that's the first point, people switching off. Second question, what is it that makes you question whether it's talking to you or to someone else? And that's the bit that most people seem not to fully understand. That's what we're going to get into now. What is it that makes people question, is this talking to me? Is it talking to someone else? And this is something that we discovered, we kind of worked out when we were still a corporate brand manager at Zurich, because we'd started studying behavioral linguistics, and we realized that there was a phenomenon going on that was, hang on a second, this could be useful. That when people are on the receiving end of internal communications, that they can basically position themselves in relation to what they're reading or watching in a number of different ways, particularly when they're reading it. And there are three core positions that people can adopt. The first is the position of what we could call a communicator. Now, this would happen, it happens most frequently with things like employee surveys, when things are written in the first person. And, you know, I believe our company communicates well with its staff. Oh, yes, strongly agree, or whatever it is. So when it's written in the first person, it's like putting the words in your mouth as if you yourself were saying what you're reading. Okay, so that's the communicator position. The second position is that of the audience. And that's when you don't think you're the one saying the words, but you are the person to whom the words are being said. So you're reading something and it's a case of, well, okay, this is something I need to take on board. I need to respond to this. I need to pay attention, and so on. So this is where you feel that the communicator is talking to you. And that's really important if the communications are going to work, because if people are not in the audience position, they may well be in a third position, which is that of a detached observer. And this is where you don't think that you're the one saying the words, nor the person to whom those words are being said, but rather you're a fly on the wall, kind of eavesdropping on the communication between the communicator and the audience. Okay, so, and this is what would happen if you were on a copies list for an email, for example, and that's absolutely fine. You know, there's no problem with that, except what we discovered happened when we got into serious trouble back in our days in Zurich, because we had messed up. We'd made a mistake and we had broken a rule. It was to do with cybersecurity, which back then wasn't nearly as big a deal as it is now. And so we were hauled into the director's office, and he was giving us he was a very nice guy, but he was saying, didn't you realize you weren't supposed to do this? And we said, no, we didn't know anything about it. He said, well, there was a memo about it a couple of months ago. Don't know, news to us. And so he pulled it up on the screen and we looked at it and we thought, had this very, very vague recollection of it. But at the time we dismissed it because we didn't think it was relevant. And so that got us questioning, well, hang on a second, why? What was going on? And this was when we started our journey to discovering a total of 7 different triggers, which can push people out of the audience position and into the detached observer. And when that happens, well, obviously, when you're reading stuff and you're sort of thinking, oh, is this talking to me? Is it talking to someone else? What's happening in that situation is you have stumbled across one of those triggers. So these are really serious business because they can cause all sorts of communication failures and incur all sorts of those costs. So let's just quickly give you an overview of these triggers. The first of them is actually hidden away inside the briefing process. And again, this is why you cannot use the external communication briefing process, whether it's marketing or PR, for internal communication, because again, the audience time comes for free. And if people are switching off when they're receiving external communications, that's not a problem. But if it's happening internally, it seriously is a problem. And there are only 2 possibilities here. That those people either never needed to receive the communication in the first place, in which case they just had their time wasted up to that point, or if they did need to receive it, your organization will be incurring those communication failure risks and costs. There is no third option. This is the only way it can go. So we have to have a briefing process which can actually do a job that the external briefing process doesn't have to do. And there are 3 things it has to be able to do. Number 1, make sure that it's not wasting the time of loads of people who don't need it, because that's got to be paid for. Secondly, that it is including everybody who needs to be communicated with. But thirdly, it's making sure that that is just one audience. Because, okay, these are all the people we need to communicate with, but does that mean it's just one audience? Because with internal communication, you can often have sub-audiences. So if you've got a situation where you've actually got a communication that's going to two sub-audiences, audience A and audience B, and you produce just one communication, then all the time that communication is talking to audience A, the people in audience B are thinking, this isn't talking to me, and they're switching off. And then when the communication turns its attention to people in audience B, starts talking to them, the people in audience A are switching off. But the people in audience B probably aren't even there anymore. So it's a real problem. So this is an incredibly delicate balancing act that the internal communication briefing process needs to accomplish, which you may or may not actually know how to do at the moment. So that's the briefing trigger. But there are also 6 linguistic triggers hidden away inside the English language. And so let's just quickly describe these for you. We haven't got time to go into them in any kind of detail, but the first of them is an I trigger. They're all to do with personal pronouns. Then there are 4 you triggers, and there is 1 we trigger. Okay. And the important thing about these triggers is that they actually sit outside of the traditional rules of English grammar and syntax, and they only affect internal communication. Marketing communications doesn't matter. PR communication doesn't matter. Novels, newspapers, TV programs, theatre plays, doesn't matter. The only place they can cause mayhem is internal communication. Okay, probably why they've gone sort of unnoticed for so long, because they're not mainstream. They are unique to internal communication outside of the traditional rules of English grammar, which means you can have, a perfectly grammatically perfect piece of communication, which will still fail and switch people off. And this is important to recognize, because a lot of people may consider themselves to be really good writers, and they've had classical education, their grammar's excellent and all that kind of stuff, and they don't get fazed by the passive voice and the subjunctive mood and whatever. But that's got nothing to do with it. These are beyond traditional English grammar. Okay, so that then raises the question of, okay, does your organization have explicit language standards, and can they deliver shared justifiable confidence? We said when we first asked that question, that second question, that it might be difficult for you to answer. Well, now you probably know the answer, because unless your language standards include these linguistic triggers, the answer is no. Sorry, but that's just how it is. And please don't shoot the messenger, because there's a difference between inventing something and discovering something. Okay, Newton didn't invent gravity; it was already there. And Darwin didn't invent evolution. It was already there. They just discovered it was there and explained it. And that's what we've done with these triggers. We didn't invent them. They were already there. They're already causing the kind of damage they're doing. But we do feel kind of bad for having brought you to the point where you now perhaps know that maybe if you have language standards, they ain't cutting it. So how can we make this up to you? Well, we'd like to give you a little gift, if we may, because there's one more thing that we can share with you about the positions that people can adopt. And we'd like to make this full screen for you, because maybe you'd like to do a screen grab of it, because it might be something that you want to share with the people who have to sign off communications. Okay, let's just ask you this very simple question. When someone's in the position of approving a communication, which position is that? Are they in the communicator position? Are they going to be in the audience? Are they detached observer? That's interesting, isn't it? The honest answer is we don't know. Nobody knows. There is no right or wrong position for anyone to be in when they're approving communications. In fact, the very question, which position are they going to be in, is itself misleading. Who says there's just one? People could be adopting different ones. They could be bouncing around between them as they're doing their approving. However, let's just imagine that you've done a communication for someone and you've written it from the audience position, but because it's going out in their name, the person who's approving it might actually be approving it from the communicator position. Might that be a reason why they're not getting quite how you've done it? And they're not conscious of it. So, and maybe you're not conscious of it. So maybe when you're writing it, you can write it from the audience position, and then imagine, okay, how's this person who's got to sign it off actually going to respond if they're in the communicator position? And you can ask them beforehand, share this with them beforehand, and ask them how they're going to position themselves when they're reading it through before signing it off. And you can check, okay, this bit isn't going to sit with them, but you've got now a vocabulary with which to have that conversation. Okay, and in a group situation where a whole team of people are signing something off, well, what if one of those people is in the communicator position and the second person is in the audience position and the third person's in the detached observer? What are the chances all three of them are going to have the same gut reaction to the words in front of them? Is this starting to make sense to you? This has been incredibly useful, we found, when we've invited people to share it with the people that they've had difficulties with. And it's amazing how potent this can be in getting people on board, people who've been intransigent for years, suddenly going, oh, I never realized I was doing that. Or sometimes I say, I kind of knew I was doing, but I've never been able to sort of understand quite what I was doing. This can be extremely powerful. We'd like to give this to you as a gift, a takeaway, so you can start, if you've got anybody you have challenges with when it comes to getting stuff approved and signed off. This is not the whole story, by the way. There is quite a bit more to it than just this, but this can be an extremely useful starting point to getting people to understand, oh, hang on a second, there is actually a mechanism, there is a process here that I'm using that I never realized I was using. And maybe there are ways of negotiating this more healthily. So that's something we'd like to just leave you with in some ways, before we just sort of do a very quick recap on everything we've covered. So just so we're all kind of up to date with what have we talked about in this session so far. First of all, the costs of people switching off, the risks that are there. We need to sort of share those with leaders. If you want to actually make changes and they're a bit resistant to them, then being able to share those costs and risks with them can be a useful starting point. Then there's the question of the noise. All of that noise that's going on, that's getting in the way and stopping people from being able to pay attention to as much of what you're doing as you would like. And what sits behind that noise? Well, partly it's the fact that everybody's been backed into this disempowering corner where they have a duty to fulfill an unreasonable expectation because they don't have an internal communication gene and no one's actually taught them how to identify what needs communicating to whom, when, and how. So you could potentially do something about that in order to deliver what everybody really needs, which is shared, justifiable confidence. That's the kind of the game plan. That's what we really want to try and get to, which would have so many benefits for your organization right across the board, not just the switching off stuff, just being able to make people feel healthier and more happy and more confident and so on. So how can we do it? What's the process? First of all, sharing with people a process, a briefing process, which can enable them to identify their internal communication needs in a way in which they can have justifiable confidence. Then there is also the possibility of removing what we put here as bad language, but that's principally sort of abstract language and jargon and that kind of thing. And once you've got that cleared up, then obviously it can be useful to avoid the briefing trigger, to take that out of your briefing process if it's there. Not that it's not actively there, but it might be passively there. It's a question of how well your briefing process is designed such that it enables you to just bypass that trigger, so it's never going to show up. And then obviously the linguistic stuff, removing those linguistic triggers. This, what we've got on the screen, again, we'll just sort of blow this up so you've got it. If you want to take a screen grab of this, we would say, it's not necessarily the whole story, but it can go a huge distance to you being able to stop people from switching off or reduce the amount of switch offs that are happening and increase the likelihood of people staying turned on. So that's what we would suggest as an approach. And guess what? Oh, hang on a second. Would it actually be worth doing? What's in it for you? What's in it for your organization? Let's just spend a moment thinking about whether it would be worth even considering doing this, because that sounds like quite a lot of work. Well, it's not that much actually, but let's just get, again, back to that sort of business case of why it would be worth perhaps doing this. What's the value of keeping employees switched on? Well, first of all, the most obvious one is the ability to reduce the amount of internal communication risks and costs, those failure costs that are there, those failure risks that are there. Being able to significantly reduce that obviously would be particularly useful, and especially when it comes to the mistakes and misunderstandings. Just imagine what's the impact likely to be of you being able to reduce those mistakes and misunderstandings. Well, first of all, the emotional stuff of people feeling less guilty about having messed up, less shame, less defensiveness, less, they have less repeat work to do, which obviously would be a good idea, and perhaps feeling less frustrated. So there's a huge number of emotional benefits there, which can mean that people have a greater sense of psychological safety in the workplace. How great would that be to be able to deliver that? Also, you're likely to have better compliance. If you have a regulated organization, and if people are switching off and they're making mistakes as a result, then that's going to raise compliance risks. This is a way of reducing compliance risks. And also, it's likely to lead to better working relationships. How could it not if people are making fewer mistakes? When people screw up at work, that's hardly going to be good for their working relationships with their colleagues, is it? So this can help with that. And then there's also the benefit of having more time, of your employees having more time to either realize more of those opportunities to either add more value or reduce operating costs or whatever. And also the work balance thing. There's people who have to sort of duck out of the barbecue on Sunday afternoon because they've got to sort out this mess that happened Thursday morning before Monday lunchtime, so they can't just, enjoy their family time as much as they might like to. All of those sorts of things that can happen as a result of the mistakes and misunderstandings, which again, you can help to reduce. And then there's the question of, customer complaints. If people are not making mistakes so often, then the number of customers' complaints is likely to go down as well. And also, if the compliance is improving, then there's less risk of those regulatory fines that might be there. And finally, there's the question of employee retention. If you've got better engaged employees who are feeling better supported in doing the job, they're actually enjoying their work more and so on, because they're not being so frustrated, they're not feeling so much shame, guilt, blah, 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 and they're getting more fulfillment from it. Well, that's going to be beneficial because it will likely reduce the amount of recruitment and training costs that your organization is going to incur. And also brand reputations, both the employer reputation and the consumer reputation. All of these benefits that can arise from you being able to simply reduce the mistakes and misunderstandings as a result of keeping more people switched on. So the bottom line impact of all this is, measurably higher brand value, lower operating costs, and happier and healthier, psychologically healthier, but also physically healthier, given the way in which psychology impacts people's bodies and so on. So this is the kind of thing that you can accomplish through being able to simply reduce the amount of times that people are switching off from communication, which brings us to the question of, okay, how do you make it happen? You've got to put your own oxygen mask on first. And that means looking at the design of your briefing process and whether that can deliver shared justifiable confidence and your language standards. If you can just take care of those two things, you can accomplish so much, add so much value. The question is, well, that's all very well, Rob, but how do I do that? This is where, if you would like to do that, we can share with you how, if you wanted to, you could work with us. We offer a couple of different types of ways in which we help you. One of them is through doing evaluations. So we can actually look at some examples of what your organization is producing in terms of communications. If they're ones that hang on a second, we think there was a problem with this or there's a problem with that, we can actually evaluate it for you, go through it and say, okay, are there linguistic triggers in here? Obviously, we would sign an NDA if you needed an NDA signed, and that's something that we'd be more than happy to do. But we can go through samples of communications and look at them for you and tell you, well, yes, these are some things that you've got, because very often we find that many organizations have specific linguistic triggers almost hardwired into their unconscious corporate tonality. And so very often the same triggers keep cropping up time and time and time again. So we can go through them for you and tell you, have you got an issue here and what would you need to actually do to fix it? And then there's also the issue of the briefing process. Is your briefing process up to scratch? So if you have a question template, because you may not have anything written down, it may be something you're just carrying around in your head. But if you were to document it, and we could look at that for you and say, okay, there are ways in which you could actually improve this such that you're going to avoid that briefing process trigger. And it may not be enough just to look at the template. Maybe there are business policies and procedures that could need a little bit of work as well, because very often a lot of people find themselves in a situation where they have a perfect process, but they will sit down to take a brief from a client and the client plays the old, oh, sorry, I can only give you 5 minutes card. Well, it doesn't matter how perfect your process is. If you're not able to use it, then there's a problem. So looking at the business policies and procedures around your briefing process is another thing that we'd be happy to do for you. And if it turns out that, we really could use some development here, then we have a number of workshops. First of all, again, language standards. And there are two different workshops depending upon whether you already have a set of language standards in place or you don't. If you don't, then there's a full sort of language standards program, which is 2 days, and we can put together an entire sort of set of language standards for you that you can take back. But if you've already got language standards in place and the only thing you need is the linguistic triggers piece, then that's a 1-day workshop. And it's dead quick and it's so powerful. And one of the lovely things about that workshop, when you do training courses, when we talk about training courses, people very often will say, well, you know, you only use 10% of what you learn or 5% of what you learn. Not with the linguistic triggers. With the linguistic triggers, in our experience, it's extraordinary. People use 100% of it. Because once you've seen those linguistic triggers, you cannot unsee them. So they're going to be there every time you come across them. You'll be able to know exactly what it is you're looking at, and you'll know how to put it right. So people use 100% of what they learn in the language standards. And it's extraordinary how impactful it can be. Our first client was Severn Trent Water back in 1996. And it was several years later that we were attending a conference again in Birmingham. And the head of internal communications there, she recognized us, came up to us, and she couldn't remember our name. So she just pointed and said, "It's the triggers, man." Yeah, it's something you cannot forget. Once you've learned it, it's there, it's with you, and you'll always be able to use it. So that's the linguistic or the language standards and linguistic triggers workshops. And then there's the briefing process. Obviously, we can take you through a 2-day workshop to look at the way in which you identify outcomes, the way in which you define audiences, the really important bit, and also the way in which the content needs to be directed at those audiences effectively so that people stay switched on all the time. And then as an optional extra, one of the things that you can do, obviously, if you have the briefing process in place and you know that you have justifiable confidence in it, then you would be able to share it with other people around your organization with help screens or with videos or whatever. So it's something that you would very easily and quickly, once you've got it, be able to share it and start reducing that noise and the switch off that's happening as a result by helping everybody to get better and have that shared justifiable confidence in how they are identifying their communication needs. So that's a real kind of big bonus that you can get from learning that. And then finally, an optional extra is our approvals and sign off workshop, which you could do if you find, okay, we've got the other bit sorted, now let's just sort out the approvals and sign off process and we're good to go. So these are the different ways in which we could work with you. If any of these are of interest to you, then send us a DM and we'll be more than happy to have a chat about how to actually start making that happen. We hope you've enjoyed this session. If you have, then please send us a comment on LinkedIn or give us a like, and please share this session with your network, because the more people who get this, who understand how to reduce the amount of noise, then the better it can be for any organization that's able to actually keep their employees switched on. So as we say, send us a message if you would like to work with us. And thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate it. We hope you've got a lot of value from this. And if anything occurs to you subsequently, then again, just send us a message, because it could be that we've rattled through this at a heck of a rate. And you might think, oh, hang on a second, did I miss this? Obviously, you can rewatch this. We'll put it up. Well, it will be up on LinkedIn anyway. And we'll post the timestamps as well. So you can sort of find your way back to the things that you might have thought, did I get that? Did I not get that? You went through it rather rapidly, sort of breakneck pace. So, by all means, come back and watch again. And if you have any questions that arise as a result of that, then get in touch and we will be delighted to answer them for you. Thank you so much for your time. We really hope you got loads from this, and hopefully we'll be able to support you at some point in the not too distant future. Take care.